John Hanna, former National Security Advisor to Vice President Cheney, and Senior Counsel of the Foundation to Defense of Democracies. John, welcome back here.
Thank you, Bill.
Factually, I mean, was there an agreement on short range in Singapore or not?
No, the president's factually right that there was no deal on short-range missiles in Singapore. The only freeze that they agreed to that Kim promised was on nuclear tests and long-range missile tests capable of hitting the United States.
What do you think is moving behind the scenes here? Gordon Chang was with us 2 days ago. He firmly believes in the theory that because the trade talks aren't going well with Beijing, China is encouraging Chairman Kim to do this. Do you buy into that idea?
I don't know, Bill. It's possible, I suppose. I think it's probably more likely that the Iranians and North Koreans are both getting together here, knowing that the president's a year out from an election. He doesn't want to get into another major conflict in one of these two parts of the world, and therefore they're both escalating in their own ways to build leverage in the hopes that they can intimidate the United States into giving them some kind of sanctions relief in exchange for very little on the other side.
Let's see where that goes. You're following what's happening with Russia, right? We withdraw from a treaty that was negotiated during the Reagan presidency. Now, here's the rub. For years, the U.S. has been trying to get Russia to sit back and come to terms with the agreement. And Mike Pompeo, President Trump have concluded that's not happening. Dan Hoffman earlier today on what this means. Watch.
For Russia, they do want to portray the United States and the West writ large as the enemy against which Putin needs to defend Russia. But at the same time, similar to Kim Jong-un, Russia would like to potentially use his military capability as bargaining chips to reduce those sanctions that are so hurting Russia's economy.
Well, you've got all these geopolitical matters happening now. What do you think the message is to Moscow on this, John?
Well, I think in first place, as you said, Bill, they have been in violation of this treaty now for several years. They've rejected every opportunity to come back into compliance, and therefore I think the United States has got to respond. I mean, particularly since the Chinese themselves, not being a member of this treaty, have taken advantage of it to develop the largest ground-based intermediate-range missile force in the world. Listen, history tells us that if the United States just stands by and ignores treaty violations and allows its most dangerous adversaries to build up their massive military capabilities, that it does nothing to actually enhance international peace and security. It does the opposite. It's entirely destabilizing. The United States needs to respond.
What's interesting is the reaction from our NATO partners. They're applauding this move, John.
Yeah, no, and listen, if you go back almost 40 years and remember, the only reason we ever got an INF treaty in the first place, Bill, is because President Ronald Reagan was prepared to respond to a Soviet military buildup in Europe by deploying intermediate-range missiles on European soil, together with some very brave European leaders who defied the conventional wisdom and their publics to stand up to this massive Soviet military buildup in Europe.
Yeah. Speaking of the Soviet Union, their involvement in Afghanistan, quite legendary now. There is a move afoot here, John, to withdraw several thousand U.S. forces. Lindsey Graham doesn't like the idea. Here's the tweet. Immediate reaction said, Mr. President, keep your foot on their throat. A meaningful counterterrorism force that is insurance policy against another 9/11. Fight them there so they don't ever come here again. I don't know if you would get a disagreement on behalf of the president with regard to the foundation for the argument that Senator Graham is making there. However, what he said just this week is that 19 years in one country after a war initially begins, that force doesn't become a military force, it becomes a police force. That's his opinion. What do you think he does?
Well, I think it's just not clear. The president, is signaling that he wants done with this. There may be some kind of remnant of counterterror mission here, But I think the danger is that once we withdraw our support for the Afghan government on the basis of a very phony promise from the Taliban that they are not going to try and reestablish their jihadist tyranny and very much in cooperation still with al-Qaeda, that once that Afghan government is brought down, Taliban, al-Qaeda comeback, it's going to be infinitely hard for the United States to conduct an effective counterterrorism mission without an Afghan government there.
Apologize for the interruption. Do you have a better solution then, John?
No, I mean, listen, the solution is more blood, sweat, and tears. I think the mission in Afghanistan, as frustrating as long as it's been, Bill, with those several thousand troops there supporting an Afghan government, we're not in the front lines doing the fighting. I still think it's a sustainable mission if you believe that things can actually get much, much worse. But it needs a president who actually believes that avoiding a Taliban al-Qaeda resurgence in the place that spawned 9/11 is important enough to continue this kind of sacrifice.
Appreciate your analysis. Thank you, John, and thanks for coming back today. John Hanna there in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.